The moment Terence Hawthorne's breathing stopped, his lawyer cleared his throat and announced the will would leave everything to the daughter he'd been forced to give up for adoption decades ago. I set down the morphine dispenser, thinking my 6 months of caring for this bitter old man were finally over. Then attorney James Mitchell looked directly at me and asked, "What is your full legal name? If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from." Now let me back up and tell you how I ended up in this surreal situation. 3 days earlier, I'd answered a classified ad for a live-in caregiver. At 62, with my husband dead and my savings drained by his medical bills, I was desperate for work. The Hawthorne mansion sat on 5 acres in Connecticut's wealthiest district, all stone walls and intimidating gates. "You're not what I expected," Terence had wheezed from his hospital bed when I first walked into his bedroom. His eyes were sharp despite his failing body, studying me like I was a puzzle to solve. "Most people aren't," I'd replied, adjusting his pillows. "That's what makes life interesting." He'd actually smiled at that, the first genuine expression I'd see from him for weeks. The job paid better than anything I'd ever earned, enough to finally get ahead instead of just surviving. But Terence Hawthorne was the most demanding patient I'd ever encountered. His housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, warned me the first week. "He's driven away 12 caregivers in 2 years. Don't take anything personally." But there was something about the way Terence looked at me sometimes, like he was seeing a ghost. And lately, his questions had become more personal, more probing. Yesterday, he'd asked about my childhood, my family, details that seemed unnecessary for a dying man and his employee. Now, staring at the lawyer in this mahogany-paneled study, I felt that familiar chill of dread I'd learned to trust over the years. Something wasn't right about this whole situation. "Margaret Collins," I answered carefully. "Why do you need to know?" Attorney Mitchell exchanged a meaningful glance with his assistant. "Because Mrs. Collins, there's something Mr. Hawthorne discovered about you that changes everything." "What could Terence possibly have discovered about me?" I asked, though my hands were already shaking. In my experience, when lawyers start digging into your past, it never ends well for people like me. Attorney Mitchell opened a thick folder on the desk. "Mrs. Collins, were you born on March 15th, 1963? My blood turned to ice water. That date wasn't on any of my employment papers. I'd deliberately left it off applications my entire adult life. How did you—" "In Hartford General Hospital," he continued, reading from a document. "Birth mother listed as Jennifer Walsh, age 16, father unknown." The room started spinning. Nobody knew those details. My adoptive parents had died when I was 30, taking those secrets with them. I'd spent decades trying to forget that part of my story, building a new identity as Margaret Collins, wife and mother and caregiver. "I don't understand what this has to do with anything," I managed, though my voice sounded far away. Mitchell's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia, spoke up. "Mr. Hawthorne hired private investigators 6 months ago, the same day you started working here." 6 months ago. The day I'd walked into this house, desperate for work and a place to live. The day Terence had looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. Because maybe, in a way, he had. "He suspected something from your first interview," Mitchell continued. "Your facial structure, your mannerisms, certain responses to his questions, so he had you investigated." I thought about all those personal questions Terence had asked, about my childhood, my memories, my fears. I'd chalked it up to loneliness, an old man desperate for connection. But he'd been testing me, comparing my answers to information he already possessed. "What did he find?" I whispered. Mitchell pulled out a photograph, black and white and clearly decades old. It showed a young man with dark hair and intense eyes standing next to a girl who couldn't have been more than 16. She was pregnant, her belly round under a simple dress, her face filled with the kind of fear that comes from being in love with the wrong person at the wrong time. I'd never seen this photograph before, but I recognized the girl immediately. She had my eyes, my nose, my stubborn chin. She looked exactly like I had at that age, which was impossible because I'd never been pregnant as a teenager. "This is your birth mother, Jennifer Walsh," Mitchell said gently, "and this is Mr. Hawthorne, taken in 1962 when he was 18 years old." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Terence Hawthorne hadn't hired me by accident. He'd been looking for his daughter for over 60 years, And somehow I'd walked right into his house. But there was one problem with his theory. I wasn't his daughter. I couldn't be. "There's been a mistake," I said firmly, though my hands wouldn't stop trembling. My birth mother's name was Sarah Chen, not Jennifer Walsh, and she was 22, not 16. Attorney Mitchell and Patricia exchanged another one of those looks that made my stomach clench. They knew something I didn't, and in my experience, that never meant good news for the person left in the dark. "Mrs. Collins," Patricia said gently, "we understand this is overwhelming, but we have documentation that proves otherwise." She slid another folder across the desk toward me. Inside were copies of birth certificates, adoption papers, hospital records, documents I'd never seen before, but that apparently detailed my entire origin story. According to these records, Mitchell explained, Jennifer Walsh gave birth to a daughter on March 15, 1963. The baby was immediately placed for adoption through Catholic Charities. The adoptive family was Paul and Ellen Collins. My adoptive parents' names, the people who'd raised me, loved me, given me their last name and a stable home. But according to them, my birth mother had been a college student named Sarah, who'd made one mistake and needed help getting back on track. My parents would never have lied to me about something this important, I insisted. But even as I said it, I could hear the doubt creeping into my voice. Adoption records were often modified to protect all parties involved, Patricia explained. It was common practice to change details, create new narratives that would be easier for adopted children to accept. I stared at the photograph of Jennifer Walsh and the young man who claimed to be Terrence Hawthorne. The resemblance was undeniable. The girl in the picture could have been my twin at that age. But if this was true, it meant everything I'd believed about my origins was a lie. "What happened to Jennifer?" I asked, surprising myself with the question. Mitchell's expression grew somber. "She died in a car accident 6 months after giving birth. She was driving to see the baby, to see you when it happened. Mr. Hawthorne spent the next 40 years searching for the daughter he'd never gotten to meet. A daughter who'd been raised by loving parents under a different name, with a completely different story about her beginnings. A daughter who'd grown up, married, raised children of her own, and never knew she was connected to one of the wealthiest families in Connecticut. If this is true," I said slowly, "if I really am his daughter, then why didn't he tell me? Why hire me as a caregiver instead of just introducing himself?" Patricia smiled sadly. "Because he was afraid you'd think he was just a crazy old man making up stories. He wanted to be sure, and he wanted you to get to know him as a person first, before the money and the inheritance complicated everything." I thought about the past 6 months, about Terrence's endless questions and intense stares, about how he'd insisted I call him by his first name instead of Mr. Hawthorne, about how he'd asked me to read to him every evening, always requesting the same type of stories, tales about families reuniting, about lost children finding their way home. He'd been trying to tell me the truth in his own way, leaving breadcrumbs for me to follow, but I'd been too focused on just surviving each day to see the pattern. "I need to see more proof," I said, though my voice was barely above a whisper. "This is all it's impossible." Mitchell nodded as if he'd expected this reaction. "Mr. Hawthorne anticipated your skepticism. He left detailed instructions for exactly this scenario. He opened another file, this one containing what appeared to be a handwritten letter. The paper was expensive stationery, the kind Terrence had always used for his personal correspondence. He wrote this 3 months ago," Mitchell explained, "after the investigators confirmed their findings. With shaking hands, I took the letter and began to read. My dearest Margaret, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're finally learning the truth. I was too much of a coward to tell you while I was alive. You are my daughter, the child I've searched for every day since Jennifer died. I know this must be shocking, overwhelming, perhaps even unwelcome news. You've built a life as Margaret Collins, and that life has meaning and value completely separate from me. I don't want to take that away from you. But I also couldn't die without you knowing that you were wanted, that you were loved, that your birth was not a mistake to be hidden away. Jennifer loved you fiercely, even in the short time she carried you, and I have loved the idea of you every day for 62 years. I hired you not just because I needed care, but because I needed to know the woman my daughter had become. And Margaret, I could not be prouder. You are kind but not weak, strong but not cruel, intelligent without being pretentious. You are everything I hoped you would be, and things I never dared dream. I know you must have questions about why I gave you up, why I didn't fight harder to keep you. The truth is complicated and painful, but you deserve to know it all. The letter continued for 2 more pages, detailing the circumstances of his relationship with Jennifer, his family's pressure to give up the baby, his decades of regret and searching. It painted a picture of a young man torn between love and duty, who'd made a choice that haunted him for the rest of his life. But it was the final paragraph that made my hands shake so violently I could barely hold the paper. I've left you everything, Margaret. Not because I'm trying to buy your forgiveness or your love, but because it all belongs to you anyway. You are my heir, my legacy, my greatest treasure. Use it wisely. Use it well. And know that wherever I am now, I'm finally at peace knowing you're safe and loved. With all my love, your father, Terence. I set the letter down and stared at the wall behind Mitchell's desk. There hung a portrait of a young woman with dark hair and gentle eyes, Jennifer Walsh, my birth mother. The woman I'd never known existed until 30 minutes ago. How much? I asked quietly. I'm sorry? Mitchell looked confused. How much did he leave me? Mitchell consulted his papers. The estate is valued at approximately $47 million, plus the house, the art collection, the various business interests. In total, we're looking at roughly $63 million. I started laughing. Not the happy kind of laughter, but the hysterical kind that comes when reality becomes too absurd to process normally. Here I was, a woman who'd been struggling to pay rent just this morning, suddenly inheriting enough money to buy a small country. There's one more thing, Patricia said gently. Something Mr. Hawthorne wanted you to have immediately. Patricia reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small velvet jewelry box, the kind that's been passed down through generations and carries the weight of family history. He asked us to give you this first. Before anything else, she said, placing it carefully in my hands. Inside was a delicate gold locket, clearly antique, but beautifully preserved. The front was engraved with the initials J.W., Jennifer Walsh. With trembling fingers, I opened it. On the left side was a tiny photograph of Jennifer, the same young woman from the earlier pictures, but this one showed her smiling, radiant, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. On the right side was an even smaller photo, a baby, perhaps a few days old, sleeping peacefully in hospital blankets. Me. This was me as a newborn, the only picture my birth mother had been able to take before she gave me away. Jennifer wore this every day during her pregnancy, Mitchell explained quietly. Terence kept it all these years, hoping someday he'd be able to give it to you. I stared at the tiny face in the photograph, trying to reconcile this sleeping infant with the woman I'd become. For 62 years, I'd wondered what my birth parents looked like, whether I had their eyes or their smile or their stubborn streak. Now I knew I had my mother's eyes and my father's determination, and both of their capacity for keeping secrets. There's something else in the box, Patricia pointed out. I looked closer and found a small piece of paper, folded many times over to fit in the tiny space. Carefully, I unfolded it. In faded ink, written in a young woman's careful handwriting, were just a few words. For my baby girl, you are loved more than you will ever know. I'm sorry I can't keep you safe myself, Mama. The tears came then, fast and fierce. For the mother I'd never known, and the father I'd known too well without realizing who he was. For 62 years of wondering and 6 months of questions that finally had answers. Take your time, Mitchell said softly. This is a lot to process. I nodded, wiping my eyes with the tissue Patricia handed me. What happens now? With the will, I mean. Are there conditions? Things I have to do to inherit? No conditions whatsoever, Mitchell replied. Mr. Hawthorne was very specific about that. He said you'd earned your inheritance simply by being his daughter and by being the person you are. I thought about the past 6 months, about all the small moments that suddenly took on new meaning. The way Terence had insisted I eat dinner with him instead of just serving it and leaving. How he'd asked me to tell him stories about my life, my childhood, my late husband. How he'd seemed genuinely interested in my opinions about books, politics, world events. He hadn't just been hiring a caregiver, he'd been getting to know his daughter. Can I see the room where he... I paused, not sure how to phrase it. Where he died? Where my father spent his final moments? Of course, Mitchell said. The house is yours now. You can see any room you'd like. We walked through the mansion's grand hallways, past artwork that was probably worth more than most people's houses, up the curved staircase to the second floor. Terrence's bedroom was exactly as I'd left it, with the hospital bed and medical equipment that had been his world for the past year. But now I noticed things I'd missed before. On his nightstand was a small framed photo of Jennifer Walsh, positioned so he could see it from his bed. On the dresser was a stack of books about adoption reunion stories, and pinned to the bulletin board near his chair was a newspaper clipping about local caregiver services, the same ad I'd answered 6 months ago. He'd been planning this reunion for longer than I'd realized. Every detail had been carefully orchestrated to bring me into his life naturally, without the shock of immediate revelation. Standing in that room, surrounded by the accumulated wealth of a man I'd known as a difficult patient, but who'd actually been my father, I felt a strange mix of grief and relief. Grief for all the years we'd lost, but relief that in the end, we'd found each other, even if I'd found out too late to tell him I understood. 3 hours later, I was sitting in what had been Terrence's private study, surrounded by lawyers, accountants, and estate managers, all of them explaining my new reality in terms that sounded like a foreign language. The liquid assets alone will require immediate attention, one man was saying. Treasury bonds, money market accounts, various investment portfolios. And then there's the real estate, another added. The Montana ranch, the Florida condo, the cabin in Vermont, plus this house, of course. I nodded along, trying to look like I understood what they were telling me. But honestly, I was still stuck on the fact that this morning I'd been Margaret Collins, widow and caregiver, and now I was Margaret Collins, secret heiress to a fortune I couldn't even comprehend. Mrs. Collins? Mitchell's voice broke through my thoughts. Do you have any questions about the inheritance process? Just one, I said. Why didn't he just tell me? If he was so sure I was his daughter, why go through all this elaborate charade? Mitchell smiled sadly. He was terrified you'd reject him. Think about it from his perspective. You'd lived your entire life believing your birth father had abandoned you. How do you approach someone with that kind of baggage and say, hello, I'm actually your father, and I've been looking for you for 40 years? I understood that fear. If some strange old man had approached me claiming to be my father, I probably would have assumed he was either crazy or running some kind of elaborate scam. He wanted you to know him first, Patricia added. To see that he wasn't a monster who'd thrown you away carelessly. He hoped that when you finally learned the truth, you'd have enough positive memories to balance out the anger. And the strange thing was, it was working. Yes, I was angry about the deception, frustrated by all the wasted time. But I was also remembering how Terrence had insisted on paying me double the advertised wage, how he'd made sure I had health insurance and vacation time, how he'd actually listened when I talked instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. He'd been trying to be the father he'd never gotten the chance to be. There's one more thing, Mitchell said, consulting his notes. Mr. Hawthorne left instructions for a specific bequest to someone he considered important to your story. He handed me another folder. Inside was a check made out to Catholic Charities for $2 million, along with a note, for the organization that kept my daughter safe when I couldn't. And for Paul and Ellen Collins, who loved her when I didn't know how to find her. Even in death, Terrence was trying to make amends for the choices that had separated us. He couldn't undo the past, but he could honor the people who'd filled the role he'd been unable to play. I looked around the study, at the built-in bookshelves filled with first editions, at the Persian rugs and crystal decanters, and all the trappings of old money. Tomorrow, I'd probably feel overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing all this wealth. But right now, I felt something else entirely. I felt like I was finally home. My phone buzzed with a text message from my neighbor back at the apartment complex. Haven't seen you in a few days. Everything okay? I stared at the message, thinking about how to respond. How do you explain that you've just discovered your entire life story was different than you thought? That you've gone from struggling to make rent to inheriting a fortune? That the difficult old man you'd been caring for was actually your father? Instead, I typed back, everything's fine, just some big changes happening. I'll call you soon. Big changes. That might be the understatement of the century. As the legal team packed up their papers and prepared to leave, Mitchell handed me a set of keys. "The house keys," he explained. "And the car keys. There's a BMW in the garage, fully paid off. Mr. Hawthorne wanted to make sure you had reliable transportation." I stared at the keys in my palm, feeling their weight. This morning I'd taken the bus to my job as a caregiver. Tonight, I was the owner of a mansion and a luxury car and more money than I could spend in 3 lifetimes. But more than that, I finally knew who I was and where I came from. And somehow, that knowledge was worth more than all the money in the world. As I walked through my father's house, my house, for the first time as its owner rather than an employee, I wondered what Jennifer Walsh would think of how this story had ended. Would she be proud that her daughter had grown up strong and independent? Would she be amazed at the reunion she'd never lived to see? I stopped in front of the portrait of her in the hallway, studying her young face and gentle smile. "I wish I could have met you," I whispered. "But thank you for giving me life, even when it cost you yours." Tomorrow would bring 100 new decisions, 1,000 details to sort through. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in my father's house, finally understanding the story that had brought me here. The next morning, I woke up in a bed that probably cost more than my annual salary at the nursing home where I'd worked before this. Egyptian cotton sheets, a mattress that felt like sleeping on a cloud, and windows that overlooked gardens I now apparently owned. For a moment I forgot where I was and reached for the alarm clock that wasn't there. Then reality crashed back. I was Margaret Collins, secret daughter of Terence Hawthorne, unexpected inheritor of a $63 million fortune. And I had absolutely no idea what I was supposed to do next. Mrs. Chen knocked softly on the door. "Miss Margaret, there are some people